Chapter 24. The Gleam in the Dark. Nancy Drew sat alone in the back seat of the speeding car that raced once more over the now familiar road to the old Sydney home. Her mind, too, was racing. Her decision to return to the sign of the twisted candles had been made on a hunch, as she would have explained it, but it must be remembered that her successful hunches were always the result of constructive thinking. This had been Nancy's train of thought as she had sipped her milk. Whatever it was that Frank Semmett was after, whether actual treasure or just valuable information, it was certainly in the old house. About that there was no question. Sadie had been kidnapped from the house, and the Semmetts had vanished. Where would the pursuers be least likely to search for them? The scene of the kidnapping, of course, had flashed into Nancy's mind. Nobody, Frank Semmett will reason, would look for him or for Sadie at the place from which he stole the girl. "Don't you think you better cut off your motor and just coast up to the house?" Nancy advised her father. "Put out the lights, too." "Here goes, then," Mr. Drew replied, switching off the headlights and throwing his gears into neutral. The car rolled silently up to the big old house, dark and almost invisible against its background of trees. Nancy felt a pang of disappointment. The place looked as deserted as if no living person had been near the mansion for years. "Let us make a circuit of the house first and see if we can find the watchman," Nancy whispered. Noiselessly, she stole along on the grass, the two men following her closely. Slowly, she led the way around the twisted candles. As she turned the corner of the kitchen wing, Nancy sniffed the air. Someone had recently been smoking a pipe close by. She put out a hand to halt the men behind her, and hugging the walls closely, she slipped around the end of the house. A low murmur of voices came to Nancy's alert ears. "Who is there?" she called softly. Instantly the conversation ceased. Nancy waited breathlessly for a moment and then advanced boldly toward the source of the now hushed sounds. If the watchmen were conferring, they would be less apt to shoot if Nancy made a bold move than if she skulked in the shadows. If the speakers should be the Semmetts, she had Mr. Drew and Mr. Hill close behind to aid her. "Who is that?" came growlingly out of the dark. "Nancy Drew," replied the girl. "And you?" "We were wondering where you were," came the unexpected reply. "This is Peter Boonton. Jacob Sidney's here, too." Nancy turned and called to her father and Mr. Hill to come closer. "Boonton and Sidney are here," she said under her breath. The two groups met at the back steps of the house, each demanding of the other reasons for the mysterious visit in the dark. "Jacob and I met uptown and started to argue," Peter Boonton said. "I don't know just why we drove here. I'll admit I've been here before, but the watchman never let me get onto the lawn even. Tonight he isn't to be seen anywhere." "What's that? The watchman gone?" Mr. Drew asked. "We haven't seen him anyhow," Peter Boonton said. "Don't think we've broken into the place, or even tried to. I'm getting sick and tired of trying to outsmart this young lady here. And when we found her car in the shed over there, why, we just decided to sit down and see what she was up to now." "Oh, my car is in the shed, is it?" Nancy asked with decided interest. "That's news, because it was stolen from here this afternoon." "Who stole it, do you think?" Jacob asked. "You can be sure we didn't." "Frank Semmett took it after he drugged the watchman and me and kidnapped Sadie," Nancy said bluntly. "And that is what we are doing here, looking for Sadie." "What? Semmett did that? Why should he want to kidnap Sadie?" the cousins demanded. "Probably to get his hands on Asa Sidney's hidden wealth," Nancy said. "He has been looting this place systematically. We recovered valuable silver and rare old linens, besides bonds as good as gold that he had secreted. That is the kind of partner you had in your attempts to deprive Sadie of her inheritance." "I told you we shouldn't have taken Semet in with us," Jacob accused Peter. "I never trusted him." "Yes, he was just using us to his own advantage," Peter said gloomily. "And now he has turned kidnapper and car thief, too." "And you fall into such company, all on account of a silly 50-year-old family feud which never affected either one of you," Nancy said pointedly. "Thank goodness, I have convinced George and Bess that they must not be as silly as their elders and warp their lives with borrowed hatred." "Yes, Bess and George told me they made up with you," Peter Boonton replied. "I was mad at first, but I got over it. It does seem sort of foolish. Old Asa never in the world would have willingly caused his baby's death. His wife was mean to leave him." "That's what we Sidneys have always said," Jacob commented. "Yes, but what did you Sidneys do? You treated every Boonton like a mad dog," Peter retorted. "It does sound ridiculous when you talk it over," Nancy interjected. "And now it has resulted in danger of the worst sort to Sadie. This childish quarreling and greedy claim on the estate. Honestly, I feel so disgusted with it all. I can't even get up enough dignity to feel mad at being scolded by a chit of a girl," Boonton sighed. "Jacob, you are an old fool, and I am another. Maybe even a couple of old fools can help find poor Sadie," Jacob replied. "What's to be done?" "My idea is to notify the police and have a statewide alarm sent out," Mr. Hill said. "Yes, but what about the watchman?" Mr. Drew asked. "And what was Nancy's idea in coming here? She had a plan of some kind. Nancy? Where are you?" Nancy, however, had slipped away from the group. So her car had been hidden in the shed. Had Semet come back to the sign of the twisted candles in her car, or had he hidden it that afternoon? She continued her examination of the grounds, step by step. There was no sign of the watchman at all, and Nancy recalled with a shudder, as she completed the circuit of the building and reached the front steps again, the shock of discovering the drugged man at that self-same spot. Silently, the girl contemplated the building. Her eyes swept up and down the sprawling contours. What a story the old house could tell if it could speak. "Is that a light?" she suddenly asked herself. Upstairs in the tower, the windows seemed to show a lesser degree of darkness than the blank panes elsewhere in the house. Was it a reflection of the stars, or was it some faint inner glow that made them appear so different? Nancy looked more sharply. "It seems as if the windows have been covered so a light won't show through," she said to herself. "That certainly looks like a crack of light at the bottom of the middle window, or else my eyes are playing tricks." She started for the front door, and then recalled the ladder still lying on the porch roof, where Semet had played his trick upon her. Flanking the porch steps on either side were stout lattices built of age-enduring locust wood, up which honeysuckle and cinnamon vine clambered. Nancy reached through the foliage and gripped the sturdy wooden support. Her toes found a foothold, and with an ease that surprised even herself, she was soon over the edge of the porch roof. Heedless of rust and dirt, she climbed over the edge and drew herself erect. Yes, there was the ladder! It was slow work to handle the heavy contraption without making a sound, but Nancy managed at last to rest the top rung against the sill of the center tower window without the least telltale scrape or rattle. She tested the ladder. It was not a very sturdy affair, because one leg was shorter than the other, However, Nancy figured that by keeping her weight to one side, she would be able to keep the ladder balanced. Rung by rung, with infinite caution, Nancy mounted toward the tower windows. The ladder gave a sickening lurch as she came close to the top, and the daring girl reached out and clung to the dusty sill of the window just above her head. She did not dare look upward for fear of losing her balance. With most of her weight supported by her hands, Nancy continued her climb. 2 steps more, and she was able to put her forearm on the sill and curl her fingers around the iron peg that held the shutters when they were closed. Cautiously, she raised her head until her eyes were on a level with the window frame. She was standing now on the top rung of the ladder, a precarious position, but a triumphant one. It was plain that the windows had been draped with some sort of heavy cloth to exclude the light that was burning within, because Nancy could clearly detect the candle glow through the tiny pinprick apertures in the cloth. More than that, her sharp ears heard the low rumble in the room of a masculine voice. Cautious still, and taking infinite pains to retain her balance, Nancy thrust her fingers under the edge of the window and sought to lift it. She was rewarded as the frame moved upward 1/2 inch, then 1 inch, and yet another 1/2. Then the frame gave a tiny squeak and seemed to stick, and for a breathless moment Nancy ducked her head and waited for detection. However, the voice droned on without interruption, and Nancy again dared to raise her eyes to the level of the sill. The cloth had evidently been fastened to the inner frame, not to the window sash, because the gap she had made by raising the window was still covered. Though Nancy could make no use of her eyes in gathering information about what was going on in the tower room, she could still make good use of her sense of hearing. She realized that the voice was Frank Semmet's. Nancy had known it would prove to be his.
"You and that Drew girl spent the whole day up here. I'm sure you know where the stuff is. Old Asa had plenty. Where is it? Don't sniffle. You won't ever see Nancy again anyhow, so you might as well tell. If you'll let us see where the stuff is, or where you and she hid it, you'll get your share. If you don't tell, you'll have to come with us anyhow, and you'll have to work hard for a living, 'cause we ain't got anything, see? You like them pretty clothes you got on, don't you? Come on and tell. I'll give you 1 minute more, and then you'll get another taste of the whip."
The brutal voice droned on and on and on, and through it all Nancy could hear the quiet weeping of Sadie.
"I tell you, I know nothing,"
the orphan choked.
40 seconds more, and then the whip again,"
Mrs. Semmet chimed in.
35 seconds. "And what's more, if you won't tell us, we'll get Nancy Drew as easy as we got you," Semmet said. "We'll set a trap for her because we'll make you write a note to her to come to see you. Then you can watch us force her to tell where the gold is."
"Oh, don't, please," Sadie wept.
"I'll work for you, do anything for you, but don't harm Nancy." "Time's up,"
Mrs. Semmet said. Nancy, shaken with horror at Sadie's torture, lifted the cloth that hung over the window. She peered in on a dramatic tableau. Sadie, her pretty new frock rumpled and stained, one sleeve all but ripped off and her hair in disarray, stood leaning against the old table desk with the secret door not 3 feet from Nancy. Her face was turned in profile, staring toward Frank Semmet and his wife. Mrs. Semmet stood with arms folded, an evil smile on her face, while her husband was slowly rolling up his sleeves. One hand clenched a thick willow rod.
"Open the closet, Emma,"
Semmet said, turning to his wife.
"We'll stick her in there when we're through with her."
Mrs. Semmet turned toward a door in the wall, and while the attention of the evil pair was momentarily diverted, Nancy reached through the opening and tapped on the desk. "Sadie," she whispered. At the ghost-like voice coming out of thin air, Sadie's overwrought nerves snapped. She screamed and toppled to the floor. Semmet wheeled and saw the fluttering cloth at the window. With a snarl, he rushed forward, his hands thrust out to topple over the ladder on which Nancy swayed. End of chapter 24.